The next commentary I'll release is looking at 40 minutes long, and that's going to take a while and plenty of willpower, so I was glad to find something shorter to sink my teeth into. Meet the Ephrommentator. Or don't. You can say hi, but he can't say hi back. Fucking scrub. He's a commentator I've actually worked with in the past. He made a video on Keyblade Master and Horace Tome, who covered Daisy Foxtrot's video on Keyblade's video on Nintendo YouTuber Copycat. As this is a one-shot, the topic of discussion has been isolated to how multiplayer functions in Super Mario Bros. With all that said, don't enjoy this video. Make sure to have a miserable time.
Starting things off with Nintendo's first franchise they debuted on the NES in 1985, Mario. Where I'd have to say that the worst thing about this series of games is that when they do include a multiplayer mode, it almost always is underwhelming. Even though it's a vital focus of games like Super Mario 3D World and the new Super Mario Bros. Console entries, it always felt cumbersome to have 4 separate characters on screen at one time, as it forces players to stay together rather than explore on their own.
So you find it cumbersome for the players to stick together as opposed to exploring on their own, despite the fact that in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, the levels are very straightforward, with the level design being a straight line due to those games being 2D. And for Super Mario 3D World, while the levels in that game might have a Y-axis in them, their structure is still very straightforward considering it's just a pathway to the goal, and that's not even taking in the auto-scrolling levels which are in both of these games. And if this is about the collectibles, then you might have a point, but 1, you're really vague on this aspect, and 2, that's not really a fault with the game as opposed to the people you're playing with, which can be solved by simply asking the players to stop moving ahead so you can get whatever collectible you were trying to get. Plus, giving the players the option to explore would actually be a detriment to these games, considering in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, there's not much that can be explored considering it's a 2D side-scroller and could possibly result in one player getting left behind and negatively impacting the team, considering a part of the screen is now focusing on that one left behind player. And in Super Mario 3D World, the problem gets even worse, considering with that 3D plane, the chances of a player getting left behind is much higher, resulting in them getting lost and hurting the team as a result, which when looking at some of these levels is the last thing anyone wants to experience.
Keyblade, you're assuming that whoever's rushing on ahead will just stop when you tell them to. They might, but if they're already trying to beat their PB on that level with multiple people with them, good luck convincing them to stop to get the collectibles.
Alongside that, you're missing my point that this issue isn't necessarily the game's fault and more so the people you're playing with, since Copycat was putting blame on the game for an issue that he and his friends had.
You know, if you just ignore the part where Copycat said the reason this issue even fucking arose in the first place was because of how cumbersome having 4 players at once on screen was.
It always felt cumbersome to have 4 separate characters on screen at one time, as it forces players to stay together rather than explore on their own. This reluctance for each player to possess their own split screen has always led to frustrating moments with my friends and I, as it was inevitable that someone would lag behind. The chaos that's caused from this can be fun, but it does greatly diminish the point of co-op play, as it becomes more entertaining to troll your party rather than to help them.
People respond to the atmosphere they're in, and Copycat's point is that New Super Mario Bros. Wii and Super Mario 3D World create an atmosphere where trolling players is more fun than working together. And if you want to dispute that point, well, you'd have to respond to the idea that the game either causes that stimuli, or that humans respond to stimuli. Which, I'd love to see you try and argue that key. And if you don't believe me when I say humans respond to stimuli, well, if you want a particularly dark example, Google the Stanford prison experiment sometime. It's the very famous experiment from 1971, where a bunch of students at Stanford were told to roleplay as either a prisoner or a prison guard, with the guards just having the role of keeping the prisoners from escaping. And it was found that merely having the role of guard was enough to get these people to do absolutely brutal and terrible things. These are not for the faint of heart. Now, I know it's me you're thinking, Ephrom, why the fuck are you mentioning this in a video about Mario? It's because we have the same brains regardless of circumstance. How we act in one situation is honestly not that far off from how we'd act in another. Mind you, the extent of our actions might change, or how severely we look at the situation might change, but we still have the same principles no matter what. So yeah, there's your little thought for the night.
Okay, so I'm taking a minute because deadass, as I'm writing this point annoyed me so much that I actually need to stop and breathe for a second. I'll use that second to address Copycat. How exactly does having the players stick together encourage trolling? I don't really see an exact reason for these two to be correlated. You could say it's because of, you know, close proximity, but that doesn't actually mean anything by itself. By itself, at least, it could encourage many things, and trolling isn't the only thing that comes to mind. For example, it could encourage, you know, helping others deal with enemies. Okay. And after that, I think I've calmed down enough to talk about this. So, Ephrom, do you actually understand the Stanford prison experiment? Because if you want my honest opinion, I think you pulled it out as a name drop at best without looking that far into it. You mentioned how just having the labels was enough for guards to do horrible things to the prisoners. Ephrom, let me tell you, none of this was about merely having the labels of guard and prisoner. Let's start with the first thing that separates it. Those with the label prisoner were arrested within their own homes without warning and taken to their local station. They were fingerprinted, they were photographed, and they were booked. They were treated like any other criminal. That leads me to my first major point. These prisoners were gaslit into thinking they were actually prisoners. They weren't told about this. Yes, they'd volunteered to be a part of the experiment, but they were never told when they were arrested that this was the experiment. You want further proof? Some of the prisoners didn't even know this was an experiment. For example, prisoner number 819. When this prisoner began to sob uncontrollably, a guard had other prisoners chant 819 is a bad prisoner. This made him reluctant to leave the jail, and when psychologists managed to convince him to leave, and he was told directly by Dr. Zimbardo, the man who conducted this experiment, that it was completely fake, he immediately stopped crying and just left. What they were going through was real, it was just a scenario that wasn't. And more importantly, these people had no idea that the scenario wasn't real. You mentioned the guards' behavior though, so let's go through that. They were instructed to do whatever they needed barring physical violence to, quote, uphold the law. They worked full shifts and had to refer to prisoners by their number. They'd clearly been instructed and had meetings to gaslight them too. This is not just a role, this is a complete situation where they were acting out the exact way a prison would work. Even if you were to argue that the guards were more aware than the prisoners, their behaviour notably got worse after a prison rebellion that the prisoners conducted. Often the worst treatment occurred after that point, and it was post-rebellion that the first prisoner had a mental breakdown over their treatment. The overall point is it wasn't just the role that got the guards to behave the way they did, and asserting so is looking at little more than a bullet point summary. They were gaslit, they were falling into literal roles because they believed that they were prisoner and guard. You've painted this case in an extremely dishonest manner, Ephron. So okay, what does this have to do with Mario? Here, how's this? Mario Brothers doesn't fucking gaslight people. Not just that, but the Stanford prison experiment was continuous for 6 days. Meanwhile, the Mario Brothers games can be turned off at any time, and nobody plays Mario for 6 consecutive days, non-stop. There's no getting lost in a role of prisoner and guard, because simply put, the only role they have is as the player, which could be any number of things. Ephron, put into perspective what you're comparing here. You've compared people being gaslit into roles and thus playing out those roles because they genuinely believe they are guards and prisoners. It's not just a label like you claim it is, to people choosing a certain playstyle because of it being, quotes, more enjoyable. Something completely subjective, by the way. The guards didn't enforce brutality on the prisoners because it was more enjoyable. Get your facts together and don't do this again.